I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
I am the fucking hardest hustler in the world. This is Savage Part 2. Don't tell me about shit. It's 2022 and I'm still a savage. Whatever I want, I get. Whatever I want, I fucking get.
Today, Wednesday, January 21st of 2026, is a very bad day for Sean Diddy Combs. Not because of a press conference, not because of a leaked headline, but because Netflix did something quietly dangerous. Without a trailer, without promotion, without explanation. Sean Combs, The Reckoning. Part 2 appeared, and the way it arrived is the first warning sign. When a story this heavy drops without noise, it's not meant to entertain casual viewers. It's meant to sit there, to be found by people who already understand what it represents. This doesn't feel like a sequel. It feels like pressure being applied silently. Back on December 2nd, when the original documentary first released, most people believed they were watching the full story. 4 episodes, a clean structure, the rise of an empire, the controversies, the allegations, the federal investigation. Footage filmed just days before everything changed. It shook the industry. Statements slowed, names went quiet, conversations shifted almost overnight. But even then, something didn't sit right. Scenes ended too early. Questions were raised and never returned to. Certain names appeared briefly, then disappeared without context. And throughout all of that, 50 Cent never acted like the story was finished. He kept hinting that what people saw was only part of what existed, that certain material couldn't be shown yet, that more was coming. Most people brushed that off, until now. Because Part 2 doesn't reintroduce itself. It doesn't recap. It doesn't explain why it exists. It assumes you remember December. And more importantly, it assumes you remember what didn't happen. There's no hand-holding here, and no effort to catch up new viewers. That alone tells you who this release is really for. This isn't aimed at discovery, it's aimed at recognition. Part 2 is structured in 3 internal chapters, and none of them chase shock. Instead of new accusations, it compresses time. Old clips, call recordings, images, party footage, planning conversations. Moments that once felt isolated are stacked together until patterns start forming on their own. Nothing is shouted, nothing is declared. Everything is aligned, and that's what makes it heavier. Before we go any further, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. This isn't the kind of story that moves fast, but it's exactly the kind that gets rewritten once people stop paying attention. Now, what makes this timing impossible to ignore is where everything currently stands. Legal pressure hasn't disappeared. Civil matters are still active. People who once spoke confidently are now choosing words carefully or not speaking at all. Silence at this stage isn't neutral. It becomes part of the material. Part 2 understands that. There's far less focus on public-facing moments. No red carpets, no award shows, no polished interviews meant to reassure. Instead, attention drifts toward the in-between spaces. After parties, planning rooms, conversations that were never meant to be revisited. The kinds of moments that usually get cut. Not because they're explosive, but because they become revealing when placed in the wrong order. That's where this chapter starts applying pressure. The same faces appearing in the same rooms across different years. The same tone repeating in different situations. The same confidence, even as circumstances change. Repetition like that doesn't feel accidental, and repetition is how patterns begin to form. This isn't about proving something new, it's about making it harder to unsee what already existed. And as this unfolds, one thing becomes clear very quickly. This story no longer needs a loud reveal to stay alive. It's feeding on memory, on alignment, on silence that's grown too consistent to ignore. This isn't the start of something. It's the moment the narrative stops feeling controllable. What makes this release uncomfortable isn't what it announces. It's what it assumes you already know. This chapter doesn't slow down to explain itself. It doesn't recap names or reframe history for new viewers. It behaves like you were already there when things first unfolded and that you remember what felt unfinished. That choice alone changes how everything lands. Instead of moving forward, it starts compressing. Moments that once lived far apart in time are placed side by side. Clips you might have forgotten resurface without warning. Conversations that once sounded casual now feel deliberate. Not because the documentary tells you they are, but because your memory starts doing something it wasn't asked to do before. It starts connecting. What felt isolated now feels related. What felt random now feels patterned. The documentary doesn't chase spectacle. It avoids dramatic claims entirely. It just stays close. Close enough that repetition becomes impossible to ignore. And the same faces appearing in the same rooms. The same tone used across different years. The same confidence holding steady even as circumstances change. Repetition like that doesn't accuse. It accumulates. There's also a noticeable shift in where attention is placed. Public moments fade into the background. No red carpets, no rehearsed interviews, no polished reassurance. Those moments already exist everywhere. This chapter isn't interested in them. Instead, it lingers in the in-between. After parties, planning conversations, casual remarks made when no one thought they'd be revisited. The kinds of moments that usually get cut because they don't feel explosive on their own. But when they repeat, they age differently. Long stretches pass without narration, no voice telling you what to think. You're shown who was there, how often they appear together, and how similar situations unfold across time. No conclusions are drawn on screen, yet your mind keeps arriving at the same place. That's not accidental. This is where the timing of the release starts to matter. This didn't arrive after everything settled. It dropped while pressure still lingers, while legal matters remain unresolved, while people who once spoke freely are now careful or silent altogether. Silence at this stage isn't neutral. It becomes material. The documentary understands that. It doesn't point at the silence. It lets it sit next to everything else. Statements that once felt complete now feel suspended when nothing follows them. Confidence sounds different when it's never revisited. Not false, incomplete. And incompleteness, when repeated, stops feeling incidental. Once you start realizing you're no longer watching to learn what happened. You're watching to see how people move now that the room knows it's being watched. Reactions begin to matter more than footage. Absence becomes louder than presence. This is where the story shifts from information to observation. Nothing here is rushed. That's intentional. Rushing invites errors. Patience invites comparison. And comparison doesn't fade when the screen goes dark. By the end of this stretch, one thing becomes clear without being said. This story doesn't need new revelations to stay alive anymore. It's feeding on alignment, on memory, on what still hasn't been addressed. Silence stops acting like protection. It starts acting like evidence. And once silence is read that way, every pause from here on will carry more weight than the last. Not because anything new is proven, but because the pattern is now close enough to feel undeniable. That's when pressure stops building and starts settling in. By this point, the story stops behaving like a reveal and starts behaving like a test. Not a test of truth, but a test of response. What the documentary does next is subtle, but it's the most telling move so far. It doesn't escalate. It doesn't introduce a shocking new claim. It simply stays still and watches how everything around it reacts. And in that stillness, behavior becomes louder than footage. You start noticing what doesn't happen. No urgent counter-narrative, no aggressive denial, no attempt to close the loop. Instead, there's restraint, carefully chosen language, statements that acknowledge awareness without offering clarity, silence that stretches just long enough to feel intentional. That kind of silence doesn't appear randomly. It appears when specificity would force alignment, when timelines would need to coexist, when explanations would collapse multiple versions of the same story into one. The documentary doesn't accuse anyone of avoiding that moment. It just shows how often the same posture appears when pressure reaches that point, and it keeps repeating. This is where time changes function. Time is no longer a buffer. It's no longer something that softens memory. Here, time starts stacking moments instead of spacing them apart. Early confidence sits beside later caution. Statements once delivered freely now echo against careful phrasing. Nothing has been edited to accuse. Everything has been edited to compare. Comparison does work words never could. The viewer's role shifts here. You're no longer consuming information. You're measuring consistency, watching how responses align with everything you've already seen. Who grows vague? Who stays silent? Who avoids specifics? Who disappears entirely? Absence becomes information. The documentary trusts you to notice this without pointing it out. It doesn't need arrows or captions. It allows long stretches without narration. Silence isn't used for drama. It's used for observation. That observation starts to feel uncomfortable, not because of what's shown, but because of how familiar it all feels. The same approach, the same language, the same distance, different years, same outcome. Repetition like that removes coincidence from the equation. What also becomes clear is that this isn't about one moment or one relationship. So the lens quietly widens. You begin seeing how environments behave, how circles close ranks, how shared silence creates shared safety, how restraint is rewarded more than engagement. No one needs to coordinate. The system already knows the response. This is where the documentary becomes dangerous in a quiet way. Not by making claims, but by revealing predictability. Predictability introduces expectation, and expectation changes how every future move is read. By now, you're not waiting for new footage. You're watching the present react to the past. Every pause feels deliberate. Every statement feels measured against what's already been aligned. Nothing feels accidental anymore. As this chapter deepens, you realize something important. The story no longer needs to move forward in time. It's moving inward, toward structure, toward method, much toward how influence behaves once it senses sustained attention. This is where pressure stops rising. It stabilizes. And stabilized pressure doesn't explode. It settles in quietly, persistently, waiting for the moment when distance no longer feels safe and engagement becomes unavoidable. That moment hasn't arrived yet, but the room is no longer loud. It's watching. At this stage, something quiet but irreversible begins to happen. The story stops feeling like it belongs to the past and starts behaving like it's unfolding in real time, not through new information, but through reaction, or more accurately, through the lack of it. What stands out now isn't a clip or a recording, it's posture. The way engagement narrows instead of expanding, the way language becomes safer, the way appearances grow rarer. The closer scrutiny gets, the less specific everything sounds. That inversion matters. Normally, pressure forces clarity. Here, pressure produces distance. Not chaotic distance, controlled distance. The kind that signals awareness rather than panic. Panic reacts. Discipline waits. And discipline is what dominates this stretch. You start noticing how carefully participation is managed. Who speaks publicly? Who lets others speak on their behalf? Who maintains just enough visibility to avoid absence, but never enough to create new reference points? Reference points are dangerous when old ones are being re-examined. This is also where older material begins to behave differently. Interviews you've seen before feel altered, not because the words changed, but because the context did. Confidence that once felt natural now feels selective. Humor feels defensive. Once certainty feels edited, not false, curated. Curation doesn't deny facts. It controls framing, and framing determines how long uncertainty can be managed without resolution. The documentary doesn't call this out. It doesn't need to. It allows scenes to end without closure. Conversations stop just before clarity would land. Silence isn't filled. It's preserved. Preserved silence behaves differently. Once contextualized, it becomes information. You start seeing how often silence arrives at the same pressure points, not randomly, predictably. That predictability removes coincidence. The lens widens again here. The focus shifts from individuals to environments, how entire circles move the same way, how loyalty is activated quietly, how proximity becomes insulation, how shared restraint creates shared safety. No accusations are made, and nothing is declared. The structure speaks. By now, you're no longer evaluating whether something is true or false. You're evaluating whether the response makes sense given everything that's already been seen. And increasingly, it doesn't. That dissonance isn't resolved. The documentary lets it sit, because unresolved tension doesn't fade. It waits. This is the moment where attention fully matures. Viewers aren't reacting emotionally. They're observing structurally, comparing behavior across years instead of moments. And once that shift happens, control becomes harder to maintain, because control depends on fragmentation, on moments staying separate, on time smoothing things out. That fragmentation has collapsed. As this chapter settles, the pressure doesn't announce itself. It surrounds. It comes from memory, from alignment, one from expectation, from the understanding that every future move will now be read against what's already been seen. Nothing new needs to happen for that weight to remain. It's already there, and it isn't going anywhere. By now, the story no longer feels like it's being pushed forward. It feels like it's being held in place. Nothing new explodes onto the screen. No dramatic escalation. No sudden revelation meant to reset the conversation. And that's intentional. Because at this point, the weight of the story isn't coming from what's revealed. It's coming from what refuses to be resolved. You start to feel how carefully everything is being managed. Statements arrive, but only just. Enough to acknowledge awareness. Never enough to create alignment. Language stays broad. Timelines stay blurred. Specifics remain just out of reach. That gap is no longer accidental. Earlier, silence felt temporary. Now it feels structural. You begin to notice how often explanations stop at the same point. Right before clarity would force two versions of events to exist side by side. Right before responsibility would need to be placed instead of referenced. Right before the story would stop being flexible. Flexibility is protection. As long as things remain open-ended, nothing has to collapse. But once alignment happens, once moments are forced to coexist without distance, control becomes harder to maintain. The documentary understands this and leans into stillness. It doesn't rush to the next clip. It allows discomfort to settle. Scenes linger just long enough for you to notice what isn't being said, and that absence grows louder with time. This is where attention shifts again. Will viewers stop asking what happened? They start asking why the same response keeps appearing in the same way. Why distance always shows up at the same pressure points. Why engagement narrows instead of expanding when scrutiny increases. Those questions don't need answers to persist. They feed on repetition. And repetition is everywhere now. The same tone across different years. The same restraint across different situations. The same silence arriving at the same moment. Not chaos. Consistency. Consistency reframes everything. It turns what once felt explainable into something that feels designed. Not orchestrated in a dramatic sense, but refined over time. Learned. Repeated because it worked. For years, this approach relied on one thing above all else. That attention would eventually move on. That time would soften memory. That distance would do the work explanation never had to do. But time isn't behaving the same way here. Instead of erasing, it's stacking. Old interviews resurface and land differently. Past statements feel incomplete when nothing ever followed them. Casual moments feel heavier once they're no longer isolated. The story no longer lives in the present moment. It lives across timelines that now sit side by side. This is where the documentary becomes dangerous without ever raising its voice. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't demand belief. It simply allows continuity to exist in one frame. And continuity creates gravity. By this point, the audience isn't emotionally charged. They're calm, focused, observant. That's the hardest audience to manage because calm attention doesn't burn out. It doesn't need spectacle. It doesn't need constant updates. It stays because it's watching for consistency to break. As this chapter settles, one thing becomes clear without being stated. The story doesn't need a conclusion to have consequences. It doesn't need a final statement or a dramatic ending. It only needs memory. Memory that keeps comparing. Memory that keeps noticing. Memory that no longer resets when silence stretches on. From here on, every pause will feel deliberate. Every response will be weighed. Every attempt to redirect will be measured against what's already been seen. Not emotionally, structurally. And once a story reaches that stage, it doesn't fade. It waits. At this point, the story stops feeling like it's asking for patience and starts feeling like it's demanding attention. Not loud attention, sustained attention. Honey, because what's happening now isn't about what might come next. It's about how everything already shown is being handled in the present, and the handling itself has become the message. You begin to notice how little needs to be said anymore. The documentary has reached a place where silence does more work than explanation ever could. Every pause feels intentional. Every delayed response feels calculated, not in a dramatic sense, but in a practiced one. Practice comes from repetition. This is where older material starts behaving differently again. Statements you've heard before don't sound the same when you hear them now. Not because they were false, but because nothing ever followed them to completion. What once felt like closure now feels like a placeholder. Placeholders only make sense when something is meant to come later. But later never arrived. Instead, distance arrived, over and over again, at the same moments, under the same pressure. That pattern doesn't shout. It settles in quietly until you can't ignore it. The documentary doesn't push this idea. It lets time do the work. It lets moments sit together long enough for your mind to notice how often engagement stops just before clarity would become unavoidable. That stopping point shows up again, and again, and again. Not randomly, predictably. This is where the story becomes less about any single figure and more about method. How responses are shaped, how uncertainty is managed without being resolved, how influence operates without ever needing to deny anything outright. Denial would create a record. Engagement would create alignment. Avoidance creates space, and space is where ambiguity survives. For years, that space worked. It allowed stories to remain flexible. It allowed attention to drift. It allowed time to soften edges. But now that space is being observed instead of occupied. That changes everything. You start seeing how restraint, once praised as maturity, now feels like deflection. How patience, once seen as professionalism, now feels strategic. How distance, once neutral, now feels deliberate. None of this requires accusation to be effective. It only requires continuity. The audience understands that now. They're no longer reacting to moments. They're tracking behavior, watching how each new silence fits into a pattern that's already visible. And once a pattern is visible, it doesn't need reinforcement, it just needs time. This is why nothing explodes here. Explosions distract. They burn fast. Consistency convinces. And consistency is exactly what's being revealed. As this part settles, you realize the story isn't building toward a dramatic reveal anymore. It has already arrived at something more permanent, a threshold, the place where narratives stop being managed moment to moment and start being measured across years, where every future response will be compared not to expectation, but to history. From here on, the question isn't what will be said next. It's whether anything can be said that breaks the pattern. And until that happens, the pressure doesn't rise. It holds. By the time this chapter reaches its final stretch, something becomes impossible to ignore. Nothing collapsed. Nothing exploded. No single moment arrived that wrapped everything up. And that's exactly why it feels heavier now than it did at the start. What you're watching isn't a story racing toward an ending. It's a structure revealing itself, quietly, patiently, without asking for belief. It no longer needs new material to survive. It's feeding on what already exists and on what continues to be avoided. At this point, every choice is being read. Every delay, every carefully worded statement, every moment where engagement could have happened but didn't. Silence has stopped feeling like restraint. It feels like selection. A decision to wait. A decision to generalize. A decision to let time do the work clarity would otherwise be forced to do. For years, that worked. Time softened memory. Distance diluted urgency. New headlines replaced old questions. But that mechanism isn't functioning the same way anymore. Instead of erasing, time is stacking. When old interviews resurface and land differently, past statements feel incomplete. Casual moments from years ago now sit inside a visible sequence, not isolated, not forgettable, aligned. This is where the audience changes permanently. People aren't waiting for proof. They're waiting for coherence, for alignment between what was said then and what's being done now. And the longer that alignment doesn't arrive, the louder the absence becomes. That's the pressure no statement can dissolve. The documentary doesn't end with a verdict because it doesn't need one. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't declare. It leaves something far more unsettling behind. Recognition, recognition of repetition, recognition of method, recognition of how often distance replaced clarity at the same pressure points. Once that recognition settles in control becomes harder to maintain, not because of outrage, but because calm attention doesn't move on. It watches, it compares, it remembers. This is the phase where stories don't disappear. They wait. They sit in the background of every future decision, every new appearance, every silence that follows. From here on, nothing lands the same way again. Not because of what comes next, but because of what's already been seen and organized in memory. This isn't an ending. It's a shift where the narrative no longer belongs to the people trying to manage it. It belongs to time, comparison, and continuity. And once a story reaches that stage, it doesn't need to be told louder. It just needs to be remembered. That's where this stops. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. By now, the story has moved past shock and entered something far more uncomfortable. Familiarity. Everything you're seeing starts to feel recognizable. Not because it's repetitive in a boring way, but because the responses follow the same shape every time pressure appears. The same pauses, the same narrowing of language, the same absence where clarity would normally arrive. That familiarity changes how the mind works. Instead of asking what happened, you start asking why it keeps happening like this. Why restraint always shows up at the same moment. Why engagement stops right before alignment would be required. Why silence becomes the default response instead of explanation. Those questions don't need answers to stay alive. They stay alive because the pattern keeps reinforcing them. This is where the documentary stops relying on content and starts relying on context. Context built over years. Context formed by stacking moments that were never meant to be viewed together. Once stacked, they don't argue with each other. They agree. Older statements feel heavier now, not because they were wrong, but because nothing ever completed them. Confidence from the past sounds different when it's followed by distance in the present. What once felt decisive now feels provisional. That shift isn't dramatic, it's subtle, and subtle shifts are the hardest to undo. You begin to see how power behaves when it senses that time might no longer be enough. It doesn't panic, it recalibrates. It gets quieter, more indirect, more patient. The goal isn't to convince anymore, it's to outlast. But outlasting only works when attention fades. And attention hasn't faded here. It's matured. It's slower, more deliberate, less emotional. It doesn't need new footage to stay engaged. It feeds on continuity of tone, continuity of posture, continuity of avoidance. That continuity becomes impossible to dismiss once it's seen clearly. Coincidence can be argued. Patterns cannot. This is where silence loses its protective quality. It stops functioning as neutrality and starts functioning as signal. A signal that something remains unresolved. That engagement is being postponed rather than denied. Postponement has weight. Every delay adds another layer, another reference point, another moment where clarity could have arrived but didn't. Over time, those moments don't disappear. They accumulate. By now, the audience isn't waiting for confirmation. They're waiting for deviation. For a response that doesn't fit. For an action that creates alignment instead of distance. It doesn't come. And that absence becomes the loudest statement of all. This is why the pressure feels different now. It's no longer rising. It's surrounding, coming from memory, from comparison, from the quiet understanding that nothing here exists in isolation anymore. From this point forward, every move will be read through that lens. Every silence will be noticed. Every carefully chosen word will be weighed against everything that came before it. Not emotionally, structurally, and structure doesn't forget. That's where the story sits now. Not unfolding, not concluding, waiting. By this point, the documentary no longer feels like it's revealing information. It feels like it's watching how people move once they realize the story isn't going away. Watching how language tightens, how appearances become selective, how engagement is calculated instead of instinctive. That shift is quiet, but it's permanent. You begin to notice how carefully visibility is managed now. Who steps forward? Who steps back? Who stays present just enough to be seen but never enough to be pinned down? Every move feels measured, not reactive. That kind of measurement doesn't come from confusion. It comes from awareness. Awareness that everything is being compared now, not just to the last clip, but to years of behavior stacked together in one frame. Once that frame exists, control becomes harder to maintain without drawing attention to itself. The documentary doesn't call this out. It doesn't need to. It lets the audience feel how different the atmosphere has become. Conversations stop earlier. Statements feel shorter. The closer scrutiny gets, the less specific responses become. That inversion is telling. Normally, pressure forces clarity. Here, pressure produces restraint. Not restraint as dignity, but restraint as containment. The kind designed to prevent new reference points from forming while old ones are being re-examined. Reference points are dangerous. They invite alignment. Alignment invites accountability. So distance becomes the safer option. You start noticing how often narratives drift toward emotion instead of fact, toward intention instead of timeline, toward values instead of specifics. None of that is accidental. It's a way to speak without creating something that can be placed beside the past. Placed beside the past, things change. The documentary understands this and continues doing something quietly effective. It removes isolation. Moments no longer exist alone. Statements don't float without context. Silence doesn't feel neutral. Everything is connected now. This is where older material feels transformed. Interviews you've seen before don't sound the same. Casual remarks feel heavier. Confidence feels rehearsed. Not because the words changed, but because the frame did. The frame is everything. And once the frame is visible, the audience's role changes again. Viewers aren't reacting. They're auditing, tracking consistency, measuring how often the same response appears under different circumstances. That kind of attention doesn't burn out. It doesn't need new drama. It stays because it's watching process, not spectacle. By now, the story doesn't belong to the present moment. It belongs to memory being reorganized in real time. And once memory reorganizes itself, silence stops being an option that feels safe. It starts feeling noticed. This is the phase where nothing dramatic needs to happen for the pressure to continue. The pressure is already embedded in comparison, in expectation, in the quiet sense that every future response will be read against what's already been aligned. Nothing explodes here. And that's the point. Because explosions distract. They fade. What lasts is continuity. And continuity is exactly what this chapter has exposed without ever needing to say it out loud. From here on, the story doesn't move forward loudly. It moves forward by being watched. At this stage, the story stops behaving like something that needs momentum. It already has it. What's carrying everything now isn't curiosity about what might be revealed next. It's the quiet understanding that the pattern has settled into place. Once that happens, even small movements start to matter more than big statements ever could. You begin to feel how carefully every action is being weighed. Not just what's said, but when it's said. Not just who speaks, but who doesn't. Timing becomes as meaningful as language, sometimes more. Because timing doesn't lie. You notice how responses arrive just late enough to cool urgency, but early enough to acknowledge awareness. How engagement appears briefly, then retreats before anything concrete can form. How distance increases at the exact moments clarity would create consequences. That rhythm is familiar now. It's not chaos. It's discipline. Discipline refined over years of knowing when to step forward and when to disappear. Discipline that doesn't need to deny anything outright, because denial creates records. Engagement creates alignment. Silence creates space. Space is safer. For a long time, that space worked. It allowed stories to remain flexible. It allowed attention to scatter. It allowed memory to soften edges that explanation never had to sharpen. But now that space is being examined instead of occupied. That's the shift no one can reverse. The documentary doesn't need to add anything new to make this clear. It simply lets moments coexist. Old statements sit beside newer restraint. Early confidence echoes against present caution. Nothing is edited to accuse. Everything is edited to compare. Comparison removes comfort. But you begin noticing how often certainty was expressed early and how carefully it's avoided now. How answers once sounded complete until they were placed next to what came later. How accountability was acknowledged in theory, but never anchored in practice. Each moment alone feels explainable. Together, they feel intentional, and intention invites scrutiny. This is where the audience's role fully stabilizes. Viewers aren't asking what will happen next. They're watching how the present reacts to what's already been seen. Every move is read against the same frame. That frame doesn't reset. The story no longer depends on revelation. It depends on consistency, on how often the same choices appear under different circumstances, on how predictable restraint has become. Predictability is the opposite of authority. Authority surprises. Predictability reveals process. As this chapter unfolds, it becomes clear that nothing needs to escalate for the pressure to remain. It's already embedded, in memory, in comparison, in expectation. Expectation is powerful because it changes how silence is read. Silence no longer feels neutral. It feels chosen. And once silence is seen as choice, it carries intention whether anyone admits it or not. This is where the narrative stops being managed moment by moment. It starts being measured across years. Every pause is weighed. Every delay is logged. Every attempt to redirect is compared to the same attempts before it. Not emotionally, structurally, and structure doesn't forget. From here on, the story doesn't need a climax to have consequences. It doesn't need a final reveal. It doesn't even need an ending. It has alignment. And alignment creates gravity that doesn't fade when the screen goes dark. It stays. By now, the story no longer feels like it belongs to anyone trying to guide it. It feels like it belongs to memory. Not memory as nostalgia, but memory as record. The kind that doesn't reset when a new project launches or a new statement appears. The kind that keeps stacking moments together until they stop being explainable on their own. This is where silence becomes the most revealing element of all. Not silence as absence of sound, but silence as choice. A choice to delay. A choice to generalize. A choice to wait instead of engage when engagement would force alignment between past and present. For a long time, that choice worked. Distance felt like maturity. Restraint felt like professionalism. Waiting felt responsible. Seen now, it feels different. When you start noticing how often clarity was delayed, not denied, how answers were framed broadly enough to sound complete, yet vague enough to avoid follow-up, how responsibility was acknowledged in theory, but never located in practice. Each moment alone felt harmless. Together, they form a shape, and shapes imply design. What's uncomfortable here is how normal this once felt, how easily silence was praised, how often distance was mistaken for dignity, how restraint became the default response even when engagement would have resolved confusion. The documentary doesn't correct that perception. It lets you sit with it. It allows the realization to arrive slowly, without force. Because realizations that arrive quietly don't leave easily. This is where the audience changes again. Viewers aren't debating what's true. They're evaluating coherence. Whether what's being said now fits with what was said before. Whether the posture still makes sense given everything that's already been aligned. And increasingly, it doesn't. That dissonance doesn't erupt. It settles. It becomes a steady pressure that doesn't need escalation to survive. It lives in comparison, in repetition, in how often the same response appears under different circumstances. By now, the story isn't being kept alive by filmmakers or platforms. It's being sustained by what remains unresolved. Unresolved history doesn't fade. It waits. This is also where the lens quietly widens beyond individuals. You begin to see how environments teach the same responses, how proximity to influence rewards silence, how distance becomes a survival skill, how speaking less is safer than speaking clearly. When that realization is uncomfortable because it suggests this isn't an anomaly. It's a method refined over time, repeated because it reduced risk, until now. Because once the audience starts watching structurally instead of emotionally, that method becomes visible. And once visible, it loses its invisibility. You can feel that shift in how everything is being handled. Language softens, timelines blur, conversations drift toward values instead of facts. Sympathy replaces specificity. Complexity replaces clarity. None of that is accidental, it's adaptation. And adaptation is the clearest sign that pressure is real. This chapter doesn't end with an answer. It ends with a realization that what you're watching isn't a series of disconnected moments. It's a system revealing itself through repetition. Once you see that, the story no longer needs to prove anything. It only needs to continue being observed. Because observation, once it reaches this level, doesn't burn out. It accumulates. By the end of this stretch, something settles that doesn't need to be explained. Nothing erupted, nothing collapsed overnight. No single moment arrived to declare an ending. And that's exactly why this feels final in a way that noise never could. What's been exposed here isn't an event. It's erosion. The slow wearing down of a narrative that once relied on time to do its work. Time to soften memory. Time to scatter attention. Time to let unanswered questions age out of relevance. That advantage is gone. Time isn't erasing anything anymore. It's stacking. Old statements sit beside new restraint. Past confidence echoes against present caution. The casual moments from years ago now exist inside a visible sequence. Once that sequence is seen, it can't be undone. This is where the story crosses into something permanent. Not because of a verdict, not because of proof, but because the audience has shifted from reaction to recognition. Recognition of repetition. Recognition of posture. Recognition of how often the same response appears at the same pressure points. Silence no longer feels empty here. It feels intentional. And intention is what people are reading now. Not just in what's said, but in what's avoided. Not just in appearances, but in absences. Every delay carries meaning. Every pause feels deliberate. That's the pressure that doesn't need escalation. The documentary doesn't close doors. It leaves them open. It understands that unanswered questions don't resolve themselves. They stay active. They stay present. They follow every future decision like a shadow. From here on, nothing will land the same way again. A statement won't just be a statement. A delay won't just be timing. Silence won't just be restraint. Everything becomes response. This isn't about outrage anymore. It's about memory that refuses to reset. About attention that doesn't chase the next headline. About viewers who aren't waiting for a shocking moment, but for alignment that never arrives. And the longer that alignment doesn't come, the heavier the absence becomes. That's the phase this story has entered. Not one of explosion, but of accumulation. Not one of accusation, but of comparison. Not one that ends cleanly, but one that holds, quietly, persistently. The narrative no longer belongs to the people trying to manage it. It belongs to memory, to continuity, to the pattern that's now impossible to ignore. This doesn't conclude with an answer. It concludes with awareness. And once awareness reaches this level, it doesn't fade. It waits. It watches. It gathers weight without making noise. That's where this ends. Not with a reveal, but with the understanding that silence has lost its cover, and whatever comes next will be read through everything that came before it. And that changes everything.